Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast show, a podcast that helps foster respect through inclusion, service, and equity. Now here's your host, Staci Hegarty.
Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast. I'm Staci Hegarty, Vice President of Equity and Inclusion, and your host today. Joining us as our guest is Sophia Kristjansson, founder and principal of Lexicon Lens. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And we are very thrilled to have you. You have such an interesting background and you're doing such great work. So let's dive in. First of all, the easy stuff. Tell us about yourself.
So I am a consultant to organizations as well as an executive coach, and I focus on inclusion and belonging, helping organizations and their leaders build inclusion and belonging across their cultures and improve their leadership skills so that they are behaving in an inclusive manner.
Okay, so let's break that down even further. Now, your PhD is in applying inclusion and belonging strategies in organizations. So this is really about getting those inclusive behaviors operationalized within the organization and not just having it as part of your mission statement, your vision statement, your value statement. It's not bringing in someone like me and hoping that that checks the box. This is what happens after the consultant leaves. And how do you do that? Tell me about some of your research. Tell me what you're focused on.
To be clear, I'm still a PhD candidate, just so you know. But the research is on how to build a sense of inclusion and belonging on teams. And I'm specifically focused not in the area of how we operationalize behavior. That is something that I think comes naturally for organizations. They know how to do that. I am specifically focused on how leaders are behaving and how they're creating that sense of inclusion, as well as building a sense of uniqueness so that they create then on the backside of that belonging.
So this is where it's very interesting for me, because I think one of the big things that I hear from clients, and I'm sure clients think to themselves and maybe even don't express, is this is great, but I don't understand what you mean by inclusion. Everyone is welcome here is kind of the response that I get when I ask about how do you make sure that inclusion is happening. And the response is, well, everybody's welcome here. We treat them the same. And we just want everybody to come in and feel like they're, sometimes they'll say part of the work family, or sometimes they'll just say part of the organization. So what does inclusion really look like? And what are you really asking leaders to do?
Very good question. So I'm really asking them to, first of all, have an attitude where they are actively looking and believe in diversity, where they have an open mindset. They're interested in different points of view. And from that sense of curiosity and building a team that reflects the diversity of their community and of their profession, I'm asking them to employ behaviors that are going to specifically grow a sense of inclusion on their teams. And so I'm asking them to look for diverse thinking, help all of their people participate fully, and I'm asking them as well to continually grow and develop themselves. And when you look at these things on the surface, they're quite easy, right? Oh, I know that I grow all the time. I'm very open-minded and I want people to express different opinions and I want people to contribute all the time. But then you look at the attrition rate of an organization, or you look at the comments of the exit interviews, and if a company is asking the right question, you realize that people are leaving because they don't feel that they're given opportunities to develop. They don't feel that they're given the opportunity to contribute fully. And so you have to really focus in on leadership behaviors that are specifically aligned to the concept of inclusion.
I think that's where a lot of folks get tripped up a little bit. And the first time you and I spoke, we talked a little bit about qualitative data, that soft data that makes people a little uncomfortable because there's not really a number that goes with it. And I find sometimes that leaders are quick to brush off qualitative data as anecdotal as opposed to being actual data. So when we're talking about this information, what are we really talking about when we're talking about qualitative data and whether or not people feel included and feel as though they belong?
So I'm looking at language that people use. I don't necessarily want to make any changes in a culture until I understand what it's about and I understand what the values are and how they're being employed in the organization. I also want to understand how work gets done. There's always a way that companies, leaders say, this is how we do it. But then you talk to people and you realize, oh, that's not really how it's going. So that is a component as well. And all of those things come together by looking at the language and the behaviors that people are using. You can get an understanding of attitudes. And by understanding actions and words, you start to understand and see the spots where behavior can be improved.
For most of our listeners know this about me, that I have a degree in anthropology. So when I hear you talking about what language tells us about culture, I get very excited about that. Now, different from me getting excited about that qualitative data, a lot of leaders really, they want graphs, they want pie charts, they want to attach a number to and call it a metric and measure you against it and say yes or no, we're making progress. Yes or no, we are hitting our objectives. Understandably, that's an easier way, I think, sometimes to measure how well you are doing. Now, that's where most leaders are comfortable. So how do you measure these other things? You and I talked at one point about emotional intelligence. And I think first, I'd like to have you define what is emotional intelligence, and then how do you measure something like that?
So that is so hard to do. Basically, I'm using a type of research called phenomenological research. And that kind of research involves interviewing people and then looking for similarities in the ways that people communicate. And I also apply that to actions that people are taking. And from there, that is not going to necessarily give you the numbers unless you're interviewing a large quantity of people, which is fine. You can try to do that. But more often, this type of research is used with a smaller number of cohorts, people in cohorts. I also look at evidence within the organization. So I look for attrition rates. Who's leaving an organization? Where do they sit in the organization? And what have they identified as their background? I also look for what the company is tracking and what they ask at an exit interview so that I understand if there is a balance or relationship between the two. And then I go into more finite data. So are they tracking diversity numbers and are they accountable? Are leaders accountable for them in the organization? That gives a lot of information about how really important it is to them. And if there's a lack of evidence, as we typically think of it, then I say to leaders, there are these things that you are doing, which are great. It's a fixed start. But there's a whole other set of examples that need to be tracked that are not being tracked, or there's no synergy between them from the moment that the employee starts their employment in the organization to the moment that they might leave.
That's something that we focus on quite a bit in our work, is the employee life cycle. And how does that experience from the moment they see job posting on Indeed or LinkedIn or wherever they see it, to the day that they leave your organization, however that happens, and are those things lining up? What would you tell an employer generally they should be looking for at the bookends of that life cycle, at the beginning and at the end? I realize it's going to be different for every organization, but if you could get leaders to get on board with one thing at each bookend, what would they be?
So oftentimes when organizations are hiring, they are doing a lot of it, and they are so thrilled to have the individual join the organization that then they might have a soft landing when it comes to onboarding, right? So I first say you need to have a very strong point of view with your onboarding process. The first being, I think, that you need to build the expectation of how the values are going to be employed in the organization, what they mean exactly, and coupled with that, the expectation that employees will behave in an inclusive manner, and showing them where to go with all of that so that they can learn and they start their learning cycle with the organization. Then there are all kinds of talent processes that take over from there. And then on the other side of that, when an employee decides to depart an organization, I am looking for an exit interview that really asks specific questions about the employee experience and why they left, helping them feel safe in order to share that information somewhat confidentially, but where can the organization learn and grow from their employment? What needs to be learned from why this individual is leaving? And so if an employee says, well, I just got a great opportunity in another organization that I decided to go for, great, that's terrific. And were you looking? What was it that enticed you? If you dig a little deeper, I really wasn't getting the development opportunities that I really wanted and needed, or my manager just didn't understand how to help me learn and grow. And so I felt like I was missing out on a lot of potential opportunity in the organization, and this company will develop me. So I look for exit interviewers who are willing to probe. That's really important.
I think that's a skill that probably needs to be developed in a lot of people. I think we don't necessarily do a great job of teaching people how to ask those probing questions, and we assume that people who would be tasked with that kind of exercise, that we just assume they're good listeners. And really, the research shows that most of us are not good listeners, although we will tell you how great we are. We aren't. And as you're talking about these exit interviews and asking these probing questions, I feel like there's a tendency for organizations to skip over that middle part where you're currently building a relationship with this person. And whether or if they decide to leave the organization for whatever reason, and there are reasons that people leave that have nothing to do with the organization, but most of the time people are leaving because of something they either are experiencing negatively in that workplace or that they want to experience and aren't. Right. What kinds of things can employers be doing in that in-between whether it helps employee retention, which I believe it helps employee retention when you implement certain things, but to give them accurate data at the end to allow, instead of employees just shrugging and saying, I've got an offer for more money, so I'm going to go do that.
Good question. There are so many things. So I'm going to pick a few. First of all, a solid talent development process that hones in on the employee's strengths and opportunities for growth as well. Giving employees a consistent opportunity to learn and grow, and creating the expectation that growth is important. For example, some organizations have the expectation that each employee will spend X number of hours over the course of the year learning and growing. I think that's a very good expectation to create. It's up to the employee what's done with that, but having that expectation and linking it to performance reviews, in the sense that if there's something that as a people manager I feel that my employee can learn, pointing them to specific learning opportunities that will develop them. The high potential question I have mixed thoughts on. I think high potential civic learning is great. I value high potentials because often they become my go-to people as I'm working in the change management arena and getting new behavior to become operationalized within the organization. But it's not always your high potential who's going to be the long-term employee, who's going to be doing all of that work to learn and grow. The high potential, in my experience, has been someone who learns very quickly and moves quite quickly as well, and achieves a lot of success. And most employees are somewhere between the high potential and the person who's just not performing well at all. So finding a way to continually engage those employees is extremely important. And I would add that finding ways to engage high potentials to keep them longer in the organization is extremely important too. So I just talked a lot about learning. Then you have promotion. How are leaders promoting their people? Are they looking for people that are different from themselves, or are they looking for people who are just the same? And when you dig into that data, when you see where the promotions start to land, you can draw some conclusions about how leaders are operating. We know, for example, that women and people who make up underrepresented ethnic groups are leaving organizations more quickly than white males. Part of what's happening, in my observation, is that people are doing what they've always done. They think they're doing it differently, but they're not. So when you think they're fit in an organization, they're looking at they might not even be aware of it, but they're looking at tradition. They're looking at ease. They're looking at experience. And then from there, making a decision rather than really looking at and objectively assessing the requirements of a position. So that's a tricky area, obviously, but this is where I think that employees, or leaders rather, need to be held accountable for the decisions that they're making.
I want to talk about fit a little bit. It comes up so much. I don't think I ever have a hiring conversation with anybody that the words he, she, they are a good fit, not a good fit. I'm not sure how they fit.
Right.
What are people really saying when they say, I don't know that this individual would be a good fit for the organization or the department or the role? I have some opinions on what they mean by fit. What do you find that people mean by fit?
Unfortunately, they're not reflecting back to me what I need to see, or they're not making me feel safe. So I'm putting myself out there to try to find someone who's right, but I need to choose someone who's going to be a success. Will this person be a success? I'm unsure, because maybe the language they have used or the way that they look. And with talent acquisition teams, this is very common, unfortunately. They might not be making the final decision about who's being hired, but they're certainly part of the hiring team. And so they have an obligation to look at the way the people leader who's making the decision about the hire, the new hire, is actually going about it, and that there's an expectation and a process that goes with that, so that you don't get those reluctant comments about, oh, I'm just not so sure, how it's going to work out, although you know that they can do the job.
Oftentimes, I think what people are saying without saying it is that person's personality bothers something in my personality. And that's not a great way to make decisions about hiring or promotion or any of those kinds of things. Diversity insists, really, true diversity insists on us being really comfortable with people who are not like us.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And that has to be taught, because unfortunately, unconscious bias is a reality for all of us. And it's, from my perspective, bias can be something that keeps us safe, or it can be something that hinders us. Most often it hinders us because we make assumptions about people that have nothing to do with their capacity. And so there's so much to say about bias, and I'm thinking about where to go with it next. But I think that for your listeners to realize that bias is going to affect pretty much every decision that an individual makes within their organization is one thing. But the other part of it is, how are you as an organizational leader going to teach yourself and your people to overcome that bias or become more aware of it, so that when you have to work with someone who maybe repulses you, you just don't agree with them at all, that somehow you can move them up a scale a little bit. You're tolerating them, or you are appreciating something in them that you didn't realize. And that requires listening. That requires stopping, taking a breath, and actually employing emotional intelligence to the highest degree, because it's hard sometimes to understand where another person is coming from if they're very different than you.
How do we, the two-part question here, how do we know if someone needs to develop that emotional intelligence skill? And then how do we go about helping them to develop it? I think that's something that gets kind of squished together with personality. That's just how they are. That, you know, yes, they are abrasive when they talk to people, but that's just how they are. When really, yeah, okay, there's a piece of personality, but a lot of that is emotional intelligence. And how do you recognize what is emotional intelligence and how do you work on that skill?
We talked about the need to develop emotional intelligence and use emotional intelligence to recognize how to build inclusion and belonging across an organization. And here's where you're diving into the specifics. Organizations are very good at operationalizing just about everything that they do. But I find that organizations stumble when they need to operationalize behavioral practices, especially if they are not held accountable for those behaviors. Developing emotional intelligence, I think the first thing that is important to embrace is a sense of learning across an organization. We learn and we grow. We actively learn. We actively change our perspectives. We challenge ourselves to become more inclusive, to become better leaders, to develop our acumen in how we communicate. Then I would say that working with a leader and his or her team, their team, it becomes an exercise of, here's a set of behaviors that you could employ that send the message that you're more inclusive. But honestly, if you're not going to step back and listen to what is being said to you and play that back to the people that you're communicating with, then you're not going to succeed. Then you're going to stumble in this process. So as I work with leaders and their teams, I am really looking for the listeners. And some people are better listeners than others. If they're more introverted, ironically, they're better listeners than extroverted people. And this is found throughout neurological science. What I do is I bring those people out who are listening, and I show whomever I'm working with how to recognize the skills of this individual who might be speaking a little bit less and observing behavior more, and ask for their feedback. Look for ways to incorporate them within a conversation. I'd also say that a 360 is a really good way to help a leader understand the impact of behavior. And oftentimes, I was just working with a group this morning, actually, and so I'll use them as an example. We were diving into different dimensions of diversity. And this was the first time that I'm working with them. And I wanted to help these leaders align. So they had never done anything in the area of diversity and inclusion before as an organizational expectation. And they sit across the globe. It's a global leadership team. And we were talking about diversity. And in the beginning, there was a lot of discomfort around, what are we doing? How are you defining diversity? What is inclusion? Will we include? And as I went on and on with the program, there were some important aha moments, such as, oh, I need to slow down and listen. I never said that to them, but they understood that's what they needed to do. And that they then, what did that mean? There are processes that you can put into place. One being, for example, a sense of true collaboration across the team and asking other people for their feedback or their observations before you as the leader contribute anything. So my rule with them is ask 3 questions first before you share anything.
Okay, so 3 questions. Let's talk about those 3 questions. Is that something is it a prescribed list of 3 questions, or is it
No,
just?
absolutely not. So if leaders in a team meeting, for example, and they're trying to make a decision about a process or product or whatever, they need to first sit back and define what the issue is that they're going to resolve, and then ask everybody on the team to contribute a perspective, point of view, or potential solution to what they're trying to accomplish, and to avoid speaking or giving their perspective until they have heard from everyone around them. I say 3 questions, asking 3 questions about the topic that they're discussing to get them to slow down. But if they can do more, that's great.
I love that. I've not heard anybody say the 3 questions tip, and I think that's really important, and it forces conversation to go deeper than maybe most people are initially comfortable with.
Right.
I love that. So the last question I have for you has to do with global organizations. When you are working with global organizations, oftentimes there's this idea of we are one culture, company XYZ, this is how we do things and this is our culture. Is that realistic even? How do you take into account whether differences within the same country or completely different countries? How do you manage that and still allow organizations to be inclusive and, of course, to have kind of this overarching culture? But how do you make room for others?
So that is a complex question. Let's see. So I work with global organizations, and I'm thinking of 2 examples right now of companies that are grappling with just this issue. How do we align globally around a set of values and agree upon how to interpret those values, but then act in a regional manner that makes sense not only to the country that we're operating in or the region we're operating in, but also to the vast variety of people that serve on our teams. So global organizations, global teams, they will have people from all over the globe sitting on those teams. And so those perspectives are so varied and rich, really, that finding a way to incorporate all of them is really important. I would add to that there's a legal element to this as well, because there are certain questions, there's certain tracking, there's certain perspectives that are just not acceptable within a culture and within a country's legal system in which you're operating. So of course, those things need to be taken into account. What I like to do is I like to take the 30,000 foot level view, and I like to align people around, and I'll take inclusion as an example, around a belief system. So we believe that everybody should be part of our organization that wants to be or that is hired. Those were the words that were used this morning. And I said, everybody who wants to be part of the organization, really? And then we dove in from there. I think that helping from a global level, leaders align around, I will behave inclusively and I will value diversity is a great way to start. And then from there, when you have a common statement that everybody can agree upon, then we can go into the regional norms and legal obligations and say, okay, what does that really mean when you're sitting in North America versus South America versus Western Europe versus China and the EMEA? And Of course, there will be different answers, and that's what creates an enriched experience that then can be connected to the resource groups, the activities that they do, and to the process of enriching a company culture, expectations of inclusion. So I've given you probably a 20,000 foot view. Of course, it becomes much more specific, but it gives you an idea of where I'm coming from and what I'm thinking.
I love this conversation so much. Unfortunately, we have come to the point where we are just about out of time. So, Sophia, while we've got just another minute or so left, how can people reach you and engage with your work further?
Feel free to email me at Sophia, that's Sophia, at lexiconlens.com, all one word. You can also connect with me through LinkedIn. And my website is lexiconlens.com.
This is so wonderful, Sophia. I hope you'll come back and join us again so we can go even more detail into how this works, because this is just such fascinating research that you're doing. For those of you that would like more information on Envision RISE, you can reach us at envisionrise.com. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.